Have you ever been truly miserable? I don't mean inconvenienced, like when you get in the slow line at the supermarket. I mean really miserable. There's been a couple times in my life that I think qualify as being totally miserable. The one that I thought of immediately was one time I was traveling in the Sinai Peninsula in August, and it was well over 120 degrees. And we were out in the middle of nowhere, and our bus broke down. Our air-conditioned bus broke down, which meant that we had to get off the bus. So it's 120 degrees outside, and there is a little restaurant, which basically was a patio, and they sold warm bottles of Pepsi. So I sat on the patio and drank my warm bottle of Pepsi in no shade, 120 degrees, and then the wind picked up, and we had a sandstorm. And I remember I was so miserable that I could literally feel the sand piling up inside of my ear, and I just didn't care. I was that miserable. When you think of Christmas, do you think of misery? Probably not. And yet the first Christmas was pretty miserable. In Luke chapter 2, verses 4 and 5, Luke writes, "So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and line of David. He went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child." So we're right in the middle of the Christmas story. Last week we talked about how Caesar Augustus had ordered a census, and everyone had to go to their ancestral home. And now we have the story of how that decision affects a couple of people. And this is another one of those super familiar passages. We hear it over and over every year. So let's stop to ask the question, what does it really say? So Joseph has to go to Bethlehem. So let's talk about going to Bethlehem. This sermon was originally titled 90 Miles, 30 Degrees, and One Miserable Pregnant Woman, because that's pretty much what it's about. It's about 90 miles from Nazareth to Bethlehem. Distance-wise, about the same as from here to Snoqualmie Pass, and maybe 5 or 6 miles further, and about the same elevation gain. So it's quite a schlep to get that far. 90 miles on foot. And how do they get there? Well, if you have a manger scene, or if you've seen the story, you probably see Joseph leading a donkey with Mary riding on it. But there's really nothing that says that there was a donkey there. She may have walked the whole way, and if you're 9 months pregnant, I'm not sure which would be worse, riding the donkey or walking the whole way. But I know it'd probably be pretty miserable. The 30 degrees part of it is, if it was the winter, and let's be honest, nobody really knows when Jesus was born. There's a number of reasons why we celebrate it on December 25th, but nobody really knows. But let's say it was winter time, it would get below 30 degrees at night. I don't know whether you know this, but it snows in Bethlehem. It snows in Jerusalem. The mountains that Jerusalem and Bethlehem are on are over 2,000 feet. So if it was winter, it was going to be cold outside. And just for the sake of argument, if it was the summer, it gets hot and humid and miserable. So they are out in the elements because they probably camped. Maybe there was an inn or two on the way, but most likely they just gathered around a campfire at night and slept in their clothes. And how many nights were they out there? I don't know. How long does it take to walk 90 miles? A week? It was a long time. And with thinking about all of those things, do you suppose that there might have been a few moments along the way when Mary and Joseph were miserable? Do you suppose there might have been a time or 2 or 12 when they spoke a little sharply to one another? I mean, I can just hear Mary saying, "If he tells me we're almost there one more time, I'm going to kill him." And I can hear Joseph thinking, "If she has to stop to go to the bathroom again, I'm just going to leave her." Do you suppose there might have been a time or two when their faith was a little shaky? When they thought back over the encounter with the angel, I can just imagine Mary going, "Greetings, you who are highly favored. Let him favor somebody else for a while." Or Joseph thinking, maybe that dream that I had where an angel came to me and told me all about this, maybe it was just a dream and not a message from God. And do you suppose that they might have even felt sorry for themselves sometime? Think about Joseph. Joseph belonged to the royal house of Israel. He was a direct descendant of King David. His family had been somebody. And I would imagine that at least some of the time he's thinking, why am I struggling like this? Don't these people know who I am? And then think about Mary. Mary is carrying Jesus. Mary's carrying God's Son. And don't you think there would have been a few moments along the way where Mary would have expected a little bit better treatment than this? Can't you see them pulling off at the rest stop and seeing a line and Mary going, "Mother of God coming through"? They both have these special circumstances that might have led me to believe, if I were in their shoes, that things should have been a little bit easier than they actually were. These are real people. And they probably had the same emotions and same struggles that you and I would have if we were traveling 90 miles in 30 degrees with one poor, miserable, pregnant woman. God takes Mary and Joseph on this journey that's physically difficult, but it's also emotionally difficult. When she's 9 months pregnant, they leave their family. They leave their community. They leave the familiar. They leave their support system. They leave the comfort of home for a rock in the snow to sleep on. And that's the reality of the first Christmas. We think of Christmas as this warm and nostalgic time. But if you look at how it actually was, it's not really a sentimental story at all. Through Mary and Joseph's eyes, it was probably disorienting and uncomfortable. And now we have an entry point into the story, don't we? Disorienting and uncomfortable. A certain amount of misery. This has been quite a year. It's been very disorienting. It's been very uncomfortable. And there has been a certain amount of misery for all of us. This year, our lives and our preferences have been challenged and changed. Jobs have been threatened. A million hopes and a million dreams have been dashed. People we know and people we love have gotten sick, some of them very sick, and some of them have even died. There's been political chaos for months. There's been the frustration of dealing with people that you love who view things so very differently from you. This year has been far different than what we often expect that following Jesus should be like. It's just been hard. And now we come to Christmas. The theme of our Christmas and Advent celebrations this year is that in Christmas, everything is different. So in this sermon, we started out talking about misery. And that's probably not what you think of when you think of Christmas. But the things we usually think of, like big family celebrations, holiday dinners, parties, get-together, lots of celebrations, a lot of those things will be stripped away this year. And for many of us, it won't really feel like Christmas. But if we stop and we think about what Christmas is really about, a lot of those things that we'll miss, a lot of those things that we're sentimental about, a lot of the things that hold great nostalgia for us are great, but they aren't really what Christmas is all about, are they? Or if they are for us, let's just be honest then. We have some really good friends that have no spiritual background or inclination whatsoever. They celebrate Christmas, but it's basically just an excuse for a big family dinner. There's love and all sorts of great things, but let's just call it that. Christmas to me is I eat a lot and I get a lot of presents. That's what Christmas means to me. If that's what it is, okay. But if Christmas is about God stepping into our world, Christmas will still come this year. And many of us will see it in a different and fresh way. And that might be a blessing. This is only the second week of the Christmas story. We acknowledge that life, and this year in particular, is messy. And it can be harder than we thought it would be. And there are disappointments and tragedies on the way. But it's only the second week of the Christmas story. God isn't done yet. It's into the mess and the disappointments and the tragedies and the pain and the hopelessness. It's into all of those things. It's into the reality of our lives that God steps in. And I can't help but believe that Joseph and Mary found God present even on the trip to Bethlehem. Their faith may have wavered. I'm sure their faith wavered. Mine certainly would have. But they kept moving forward. And just because of the way my mind works, I think, what if they hadn't? What if Mary and Joseph had thrown in the towel? What if somewhere along the way, at every act of faith, from believing the first time that God was going to make you pregnant through the Holy Spirit, or that this woman that you loved hadn't had sex with some other guy, but that it was the Holy Spirit, to being dragged 90 miles, I mean, all of those things that required a lot of faith from them. What if they hadn't kept going? What if they had quit? What if they had said, this is too hard. This is too inconvenient? What would have happened? Well, it's staggering to think about that, isn't it? If Mary and Joseph had said no, if Mary and Joseph said, this is too hard, if Mary and Joseph had said, this is too inconvenient for me, our lives would be very, very different, wouldn't they? And I like to play with this idea of the inconvenience factor, because so much of what happens in our lives changes when we bump up against inconvenience. We're all for something until it becomes inconvenient. And when it becomes inconvenient, sometimes we give up and we quit. And I wonder how often God has found his purposes thwarted because people gave up, because it became too inconvenient, because it was a good idea and it would have been nice, but it ended up being too costly. What would have happened if it got too inconvenient for Mary and Joseph? Sometimes I think we forget that our actions affect other people. And I'm so glad that Mary and Joseph, if they came up against the inconvenience factor, kept pushing on. They pushed on. And how did they do that? I really don't know. But I suspect a few things. I suspect that they held on to hope. The hope that the God who had worked for them and with them in the past would do that again in the future. I think they were anchored in the reality of who God was. And because they knew who God was and had seen him act in the past, they could face the future with hope. And I think in these crazy times, in the disorientation that we live in, one of the things that we can do is hold on to hope, knowing that the God who was present in the past is the God who will be present in the future. And no matter how dark and chaotic things will become or are, that we still have cause for hope. One of the reasons that we can have hope, that I think probably gave to Mary and Joseph also, is they remembered. This is always a huge theme in the Bible. Remember. I think at moments they probably remembered that the trust that enabled them to say yes to God in the first place was well placed, and that God had been faithful in the past, and God will be faithful in the future. As you look ahead, if you look behind, where are the ways that you have seen God acting in your behalf? Where are the ways that you have seen God faithful? What can you remember where you know that you know that you know that God was present with you? Because if you can remember those times in the past, that will help you have hope for the future. I think that Mary and Joseph must have prayed. I mean, how often do you think they prayed for strength? I mean, yes, they soldiered on, and I like people who soldier on. But if you're anything like me, if they're anything like me, they would have gotten to the point where they would have said, I just can't go on anymore. And when I thought about that, and when I thought about how it must have been on that 90-mile journey, I was reminded of something that the Apostle Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. He says, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Paul faced hardships, and he prayed that God would take the hardships away. God didn't answer the prayer that way. God answered the prayer by giving Paul the strength that he needed to make it through. And I love that last line, when I am weak, then I am strong. So where you're weak today, where your faith is wavering, where you have decided that you can soldier on no longer, in your weakness, Christ can make you strong. I think that they must have encouraged each other. And that is such a powerful reason why I think God has united us into a community of faith. It's never just me and Jesus. It's always me and Jesus' people into this family of faith, into the congregation of our church, because we can encourage one another. I was talking to one of my buddies this week, and we were talking about one of our heroes, an older woman in the church. And she's a woman who is walking with great grace through a very, very trying time. And I'm not going to tell you who it is, because I'm actually hoping that many of you will think he's talking about me. Because I actually see many of you who are walking through trying times with great grace. And we were talking about, as we watch this woman just live her life, I don't even think she knows we're watching her. I was thinking that most inspirational people are just going about their day. They don't get up and say, I think I'll inspire people today. They just live their lives in a way that is inspirational. This woman that we were talking about, who's walking through a tough time, is just a mature, lovely Christian person. And she brings the grace and the love and the patience and the presence of Jesus with her wherever she goes. And that's what's so inspirational. So often during this year, when we've been urged to indulge our basest instincts, I've seen so many of you respond with your best selves, your redeemed selves, acts of kindness and just plain human decency, which reflect the reality of Jesus in your lives. I saw a quote by Tolkien the other day, and he said, "Some believe it is only great power that can hold evil in check, but that's not what I've found. It's the small, everyday deeds of ordinary folk that keep the darkness at bay, small acts of kindness and love." And I've seen that happen, and I've been so encouraged by that. People not knowing that they're being inspirational, people just doing small acts of kindness, small acts of love, who in their very small way have been put together with other people and are driving back the darkness and are defeating evil in Jesus' name, most of the time not even knowing that they're doing that. So here's an action step for you. I would encourage you to think about who you find inspirational and write them a note or send them a text, or make a phone call and thank them for how they've inspired you. And as you think about the ways that other people have been inspirational in your life, maybe you'll even come across some ways that you can inspire other people who are going through a difficult time, walking this long, hard road during this Advent season, during this chaotic year of 2020. And that inspiration will encourage other people to keep on keeping on. I love Advent. It's a time of reflection and preparation. It gives us the time to figure out what's truly important and to make sure our priorities and our expectations match up. We'll have the opportunity in these next couple of weeks to figure out what's truly important as we prepare to celebrate Christmas in a very different year. Advent is also a time of hope that reminds me that the God who's acted on our behalf in the past will act again in the future, that the dark is passing and that the light is coming. So let me ask you a couple of questions. The first is, where do you draw the inconvenience line? What are you up for until it becomes too hard? Where is that line for you? Second question, what is God currently calling you to that feels harder than it should be? And number 3, who have you been inspired by this year and why?